The air inside the Utah Valley University auditorium buzzed with a restless energy that was both familiar and unsettling. It was September 10th, 2025, and Charlie Kirk had taken the stage as part of his American Comeback Tour. For many in the packed hall, this was not just another campus event. It was a chance to hear, in person, the voice that had come to symbolize a generation's rebellion against political correctness, liberal academia, and what he called the erosion of American values. Kirk stood tall at the podium, his voice steady, his words sharp. The stage lights illuminated his angular face, the sharp contrast between brightness and shadow giving him the presence of a man who understood that every word was a performance. His supporters, mostly students and young conservatives, filled the front rows, their phones held high, recording his every gesture. Some wore Turning Point USA shirts, others carried notebooks, ready to catch a phrase they could later post on social media. But scattered across the hall were faces that were harder to read. Protesters had turned out, as they always did when Kirk came to town. Some held signs rolled under their arms, waiting for the right moment to raise them. Others sat quietly, their eyes fixed not on Kirk's words, but on the atmosphere, watching the reactions around them. Tension hung thick, unspoken but undeniable. Kirk thrived on that tension. He had built his career on walking into hostile rooms and claiming them with confidence, converting jeers into applause, or at least making sure no one forgot his presence. That night in Utah was no different. "We are here," he declared, "to take back the culture that has been stolen from us." The crowd roared, the sound bouncing off the walls like a wave. No one in that room, not Kirk, not his supporters, not his critics, expected what came next. The shot was loud, but in memory it seemed to stretch beyond sound, beyond time itself. A crack split the air, sharp and metallic, and for a split second, no one moved. Some thought it was part of the event, maybe a microphone popping, maybe a stage effect gone wrong. Then the scream. The scream ripped through the silence like glass shattering, and suddenly the truth crashed in. Kirk staggered back from the podium, his hand flying instinctively to his neck. The stage lights caught the sudden bloom of red, bright against his pale skin. Gasps turned to chaos. Students ducked, phones clattered to the ground. Others, still recording, held their cameras higher, their lenses capturing a moment that would soon replay across every news broadcast in America. Security rushed the stage, their shouts barely audible over the panic. Kirk collapsed to one knee, his expression frozen between shock and disbelief. His other hand reached toward the audience as though searching for an anchor. His eyes darted, not toward the shooter, not toward the exit, but toward the crowd, the very people he had come to sway. The auditorium dissolved in pandemonium. People scrambled over chairs, pushing toward the exits, while others ducked low, covering their heads. Some pressed forward, closer to the stage, desperate to see if Kirk was alive, desperate to understand what had just happened. The shooter was not immediately visible. Witnesses would later describe seeing a figure, a flash of movement, the glint of metal. Some swore the shot came from the back of the room, others insisted it came from the side. In the confusion, certainty evaporated. What remained was fear, raw, unfiltered fear. On stage, Kirk lay on the ground, blood pooling beneath him, staining the wood. His lips moved, though no sound came out. Those closest said he seemed to be praying. Others believed he was trying to speak to a security team, urging them to act. Within moments, law enforcement stormed the hall. Officers in tactical gear moved with practiced precision, shouting commands, their rifles raised. They ordered the crowd down, scanning every corner, every shadow. The shooter had vanished, leaving behind only the echo of violence. Paramedics rushed to Kirk's side, their gloves slick with blood as they tried to stem the flow. They worked frantically, their voices clipped, urgent. "Pressure here. Keep his airway clear. We're losing him." Every second stretched longer than the last. For those who remained in the room, it felt like witnessing history unravel in real time. Some wept openly, their cries echoing against the high ceiling. Others sat frozen, unable to process what had unfolded before them. The idea that Charlie Kirk, the tireless speaker, the man who had seemed invincible in his confidence, could fall in an instant, was too much to grasp. Outside, the campus erupted with flashing lights and sirens. Students huddled in groups, whispering, crying, calling family and friends. Rumors spread faster than facts. Kirk was dead. Kirk was alive. The shooter had been caught. The shooter was still at large. Each version added fuel to the already burning fear. But inside the ambulance, as it sped away from Utah Valley University, one fact held true. Charlie Kirk had been struck in the neck, and his condition was critical. His eyes, half closed, fluttered as if fighting to remain in this world. The paramedics pressed harder, shouting vitals into radios, their urgency betraying the gravity of the wound. Back in the hall, investigators began their work. They cordoned off the stage, photographing every inch, marking the spot where Kirk had fallen, the spray of blood, the spent casing glinting under harsh fluorescent lights. Witnesses were pulled aside, their shaky statements recorded. Each account painted a different picture, and yet they all circled the same chilling truth, that someone had come to that event not to protest, not to listen, but to kill. One moment a man is speaking, the next a single shotgun shot silences him forever. If this unsettles you already, subscribe now because stories like this don't just inform, they warn.
The chaos of the shooting may have captured America's immediate attention, but to understand the magnitude of Charlie Kirk's fall, one must return to the beginning, to the slow and deliberate rise of a man who built his life on controversy, conflict, and conviction. Charlie Kirk's story did not begin on the grand stages of political rallies or on the nightly television broadcasts where he later sparred with pundits. It began in the suburbs of Illinois, in the quiet town of Prospect Heights, where a young boy with restless ambition looked beyond his classroom and saw an America he believed was slipping away. From an early age, Kirk was not the top of his class, nor the star athlete that many future leaders are remembered as. What he did possess was an unusual sense of urgency, a conviction that the world was changing too fast, and not for the better. In high school, he sharpened his voice in debates, not by out-researching his opponents, but by outlasting them, wearing them down with persistence. It wasn't intellect alone that set him apart, it was his instinct for conflict, his ability to frame an argument as a battle of survival rather than policy. By the age of 18, while many of his peers were preparing for college, Kirk had already founded Turning Point USA, a grassroots organization with a mission that sounded simple but carried profound weight: to identify, educate, train, and organize students to promote the principles of freedom, free markets, and limited government. What began as a fledgling effort, barely recognized outside his circle, would soon become one of the most influential youth conservative movements in modern America. Universities became his battleground. He entered campuses not as a student, but as a disruptor. He thrived in confrontation, walking into lecture halls filled with liberal students and faculty and declaring that their worldview was not only flawed, but dangerous. The more opposition he faced, the more followers he attracted. He was not simply giving speeches, he was branding himself as the warrior willing to fight where others stayed silent. Social media amplified his message. While professors lectured to rooms of 50, Kirk tweeted to hundreds of thousands. His words, often sharp, sometimes inflammatory, spread quickly, gaining traction with a generation raised on screens. In a digital age where brevity and boldness outpaced nuance, Kirk was perfectly suited. A single phrase from him could trigger outrage and applause in equal measure. But his rise was not without controversy. Critics accused him of oversimplifying complex issues, of stoking division, of spreading misinformation. To them, Kirk was not a defender of freedom, but an opportunist who thrives on chaos. His defenders, however, saw him differently, a David standing against a Goliath of liberal dominance in academia and media. This duality, hero to some, villain to others, would define his entire career. And it was this duality that made his death so explosive. For how could a man who embodied such conflict fall without questions of motive and meaning echoing louder than the gunshot itself? As the years passed, Turning Point USA grew beyond anyone's early expectations. Conferences filled arenas, drawing thousands of young conservatives eager to hear not only Kirk, but the lineup of figures he brought into his orbit: politicians, influencers, and eventually Donald Trump himself. The MAGA movement found in Kirk not just a supporter, but a recruiter of youth. By the time he was 30, Charlie Kirk had built an empire of influence. He was an author, a podcast host, a fixture in conservative media. He did not merely participate in culture wars, he declared them. He painted the stakes in existential terms: freedom or tyranny, tradition or chaos, faith or decline. and whether one agreed or disagreed, his presence was impossible to ignore. It was this presence, this gravitational pull of attention, that made the events in Utah all the more disturbing. For his supporters, the shooting was not simply an attack on a man, but on an idea. The idea that their voices too could be silenced. For his critics, it raised darker questions. Had rhetoric grown so volatile that words had finally turned into violence? The truth of Kirk's legacy is not simple. It is layered with triumphs and contradictions, victories and controversies. But one cannot deny the scale of his influence, nor the depth of the divide he both reflected and deepened. To understand why a man like Charlie Kirk became a target, one must first understand why he mattered. And to understand why he mattered, one must trace the journey from an ambitious teenager in Illinois to the blood-stained stage in Utah. Ask yourself, how many movements rise and fall without the world noticing? Don't just watch history vanish. Subscribe and keep it alive.
The bullet that cut through the Utah Valley University auditorium did not only tear into Charlie Kirk's neck, it pierced the fabric of perception, leaving witnesses shaken, investigators scrambling, and an entire nation drowning in questions that spiraled faster than answers could keep up. When the echoes of the gunshot faded, the room became a tangle of contradictions. Students who sat only feet apart swore they saw different things. One claimed the shooter had been in the back row, a shadow barely moving before the flash. Another insisted it came from the side, a figure slipping behind a column just before the chaos. The police would later record dozens of statements, and no two aligned perfectly. Memory in moments of terror is both vivid and unreliable, sharp in detail but fractured in truth. Phone cameras captured fragments. Grainy clips flooded the internet within minutes. Kirk collapsing at the podium, panicked faces blurred by motion, flashes of movement in the crowd, but these fragments only deepened the mystery. A frame that one person interpreted as the shooter's outline was, to another, just the shadow. A hand that seemed to clutch a weapon was, on replay, maybe just a phone. The very technology meant to reveal clarity only multiplied confusion. Law enforcement moved with precision, but precision and chaos can appear clumsy. Officers swarmed the auditorium, shouting commands, their rifles raised. They cleared row by row, forcing students to the floor, searching bags, scanning corners. But no gunman was dragged into the spotlight. No dramatic arrest brought the room closure. Instead, they emerged with silence, shaking heads, and the chilling phrase that spread through whispers, "The shooter is still at large." This revelation transformed fear into paranoia. If the killer could vanish so easily from a packed room under surveillance, where were they now? Still on campus? Already far away? Among the crowd outside pretending to grieve? The question spread faster than fact, and fear clung to the night like fog. Forensic investigators worked methodically. They combed through the stage, tracing the bullet's path, marking the casing found near the rear seating. Yet, the angle suggested something else. The trajectory was slightly off. It could have come from a different corner, raising the possibility that more than one shot was fired or more than one gunman was present. The report would remain inconclusive. What had felt like a single moment of violence began to look like layers of precision designed to confuse. The first suspect profiles were vague. Students described a man in dark clothing or perhaps a woman with long hair. Others claimed they saw nothing at all, just a blur, just panic. Sketches released the following morning were almost unrecognizable. Outlines that could have belonged to dozens of people in the crowd. The shooter was everyone, and therefore the shooter was no one. And then came the theories. Some believed Kirk had been targeted by a political assassination, silenced because his influence had grown too strong, too disruptive. Others whispered about a personal vendetta, a grudge born not in ideology but in private grievance. Still others painted darker possibilities. That the shooting was staged, orchestrated, a performance in the theater of American politics where nothing is ever as it seems. Each revelation, each contradiction twisted the narrative tighter. Investigators did their best to hold the line, but in the court of public opinion, facts were drowned beneath speculation. Supporters declared him a martyr before his body had cooled. Critics suggested that rhetoric had finally become consequence, that the storm he had summoned had turned on him. The truth hovered somewhere in between, elusive and dangerous. What was undeniable was this: the man who had built his life on confrontation had been struck down in a moment of it. Whether targeted by ideology, revenge, or randomness, the fact remained the bullet had found him and the shooter had not been found at all.
If this unsettles you, you're not alone. Comment what questions burn in your mind and join others searching for answers. The aftermath of Charlie Kirk's assassination unfolded not in clarity, but in layers of confusion. What began as a tragedy on stage quickly transformed into a labyrinth of questions that investigators could not easily answer. The deeper they dug, the more tangled the case became. Forensic teams reconstructed the scene in painstaking detail. They mapped trajectories, measured distances, tested acoustics. A single bullet had been recovered, mangled, its grooves partially erased by the impact of bone and wood. Ballistic experts worked around the clock, yet the weapon that fired it remained missing. Without it, the bullet was a riddle with half the letters rubbed away. Security footage provided no relief. The auditorium's cameras caught the moments before the shot, the audience in anticipation, Kirk mid-sentence. Then, a flash. But the camera angle was blocked. A column obscured the view of the precise spot from which the bullet originated. Other cameras captured only chaos, bodies fleeing, screams rising. What technology promised as clarity delivered only shadows. Investigators began canvassing the campus, questioning faculty, staff, and students. A handful recalled seeing a figure slip away into the night. One described a person running toward the parking lot. Another swore the shooter blended into the crowd outside. Still, no arrest came. Theories hardened into factions. Within hours, the narrative was split into competing camps. Some were certain Kirk had been targeted for his politics. They pointed to his alignment with Trump, his calls for cultural revolution, his growing influence among America's youth. To them, the shooting was the inevitable climax of a culture war, words turning to blood. Others argued it was more personal, a grudge, perhaps, from someone who had felt betrayed or humiliated. After all, Kirk was not shy in confrontation. His critics weren't nameless, faceless masses. Many had clashed with him publicly. Could one of those debates have planted the seed of vengeance? And then there was the third, darker possibility, that the shooting had been staged, manipulated, or allowed to happen for reasons beyond comprehension. In the fog of American politics, where conspiracy often bleeds into reality, such theories flourished, and the absence of a suspect kept them alive. The parallels to history were unavoidable. Analysts drew lines between Kirk's death and earlier moments of political violence, the assassination of Huey Long in 1935, Robert F. Kennedy in 1968. Each had been a figure of fire and division, each silenced not by debate, but by a bullet. The implication was chilling, that America had entered another cycle where rhetoric no longer clashed in words alone, but in blood. For the FBI and local authorities, the case became a high-pressure test. Leads were chased across state lines, tips flooded hotlines, most false, some promising, none conclusive. Surveillance teams monitored extremist groups, digging through encrypted chats and fringe forums. Every ideology was considered, every suspect weighed. Yet the center remained empty. The shooter had not only fired, they had disappeared. Inside the country, the impact was seismic. Universities beefed up security. Politicians demanded answers. Commentators warned of a new wave of political violence. Supporters mourned Kirk not as a man, but as a symbol, the warrior silenced. Critics wrestled with discomfort, caught between condemning violence and acknowledging the intensity of the divisions he had embodied. Days turned into weeks, and the silence grew heavier. Without resolution, the nation began filling the void with fear. Students whispered about unseen hands guiding the event. Families debated whether it was safe to attend rallies. Organizers canceled appearances, afraid of the next gunman lurking in the shadows. The death of Charlie Kirk was no longer about one man. It was about the fragility of public life, the suddenness with which safety could collapse. The climax of the case was not a single revelation, but a collective realization. America had crossed a line. Whether or not the shooter was caught, the echo of that bullet would reverberate for years. We often believe violence happens in faraway shadows until it happens in front of us. Subscribe if you believe silence is no protection.
The night of September 10th, 2025 did not end with clarity. It ended with silence. The auditorium at Utah Valley University was cleared, The flashing lights faded, and the stage that had hosted Charlie Kirk only hours earlier was now a taped-off crime scene, guarded by silence heavier than applause could ever be. Kirk's death was not simply the end of a life. It was the ignition of a national reckoning. In the days that followed, America did not move on, it fractured further. Supporters gathered outside hospitals and churches, holding vigils, candles flickering against the night sky. They did not speak of him as a man lost, but as a warrior silenced. Some carried signs declaring, "Free speech has a martyr." Others prayed openly, their voices breaking as they pleaded for the strength to carry on his mission. Opponents, meanwhile, navigated the tension of grief and critique. For many, Kirk's rhetoric had been damaging, even dangerous. Yet violence had redrawn the conversation. It was no longer about disagreement. It was about the brutal reality that words could lead to blood. Critics condemned the act, but some whispered their discomfort. Had this been inevitable in a climate fueled by division? On the national stage, leaders scrambled to respond. Politicians demanded investigations and hearings. Some called for tighter security at political events, while others warned that overreaction would stifle free expression. The debate mirrored Kirk's life, polarizing, impassioned, unresolved. Then came the announcement that stunned the nation. Donald Trump declared that Charlie Kirk would be awarded the Presidential Medal of Freedom posthumously. To his followers, this was justice, an immortalization of his cause. To his critics, it was provocation, cementing Kirk's image as both hero and lightning rod. Media outlets flooded with coverage. Networks replay shaky footage of the shooting alongside clips of Kirk's most controversial speeches. Editorial pages asked whether his death marked a turning point in America's struggle with political violence, or simply another step deeper into division. The investigation dragged on, unresolved. The shooter remained unnamed, unseen, unfound. Conspiracies flourished in the absence of truth. Was it the work of extremists, a lone actor with personal grievance, or had the nation itself created the conditions for this violence? A slow corrosion of trust, a climate where words hardened into weapons. For families, the lesson was immediate and haunting. Public life was fragile. Rallies, speeches, gatherings, once moments of unity or confrontation, now carried the shadow of fear. Parents asked if it was safe to let their children attend campus events. Organizers questioned whether free speech was worth the risk. Students whispered about staying home. For historians, the assassination of Charlie Kirk became more than an event. It was a symbol, a reminder that in America, politics has always danced dangerously close to violence. From Lincoln to Kennedy, from Martin Luther King Jr. to Kirk, the pattern was clear. Words could inspire, but they could also incite. And yet, in the quiet aftermath, there was something else. A lingering question of legacy. Who was Charlie Kirk? Truly? Was he a voice of conviction who rallied youth against a tide of liberal dominance? Or was he a provocateur who sharpened divides until they cut into the nation itself? The answer, perhaps, was both. And in that duality lay the tragedy. Because no matter what one believed of Kirk, his end forced everyone to face the same truth, that silence does not protect. Whether one loved him or despised him, the fact that he could fall on stage before hundreds was proof that public life had no guarantees, that safety could collapse in an instant, that America's divides had grown deep enough to spill blood once again. Weeks turned into months, and still the case remained unsolved. His supporters held fast to his speeches, replaying his podcasts, wearing his words like armor. His critics dissected his influence, wondering whether his fall would quiet the culture war or inflame it further. The country waited, but the shooter's name never came. And so Kirk's death lived on not as a closed case, but as an open wound. And perhaps that is the truest legacy of September 10th, 2025. Not the bullet, not the blood, but the silence that followed. A silence filled with voices arguing, mourning, speculating, dividing. A silence heavy with fear, but also with recognition. A silence that whispered to every American that the lines between politics and violence had blurred once again.
The final lesson of Charlie Kirk's life is not what he said or what he stood for. It is what his end revealed, that the fight over words, ideas, and beliefs is never safe. That the stage, whether at a university or in Washington, carries risks far beyond applause. And that no matter where one stands on the political spectrum, the echo of a single shot can change everything.
What you just witnessed isn't only about one man, but about the world we're shaping. If you refuse to let history repeat itself unnoticed, like and subscribe now. Click on the box to watch the next video. Thank you for watching.